This is a read of chapter 3 and 4 of The Midwife's Apprentice. Chapter 3, The Midwife. Her name was Jane. She was known in her village as Jane the Midwife because of her sharp nose and sharp glance. Beadle always thought of her as Jane Sharp. Jane Sharp became a midwife because she had given birth to 6 children, although none of them lived. Went Sundays to Mass and had strong hands and clean fingernails. She did her job with energy and some skill, but without care, compassion, or joy. She was the only midwife in the village. Taking Beadle gave her cheap labor and an apprentice too stupid and scared to be any competition. This suited the midwife. Beadle slept on the cottage floor and ate 2 meals a day of onions, turnips, dried apples, cheese, bread, and occasional bits of bacon. This suited Beadle. And so Beadle remained the midwife's apprentice as spring drew near and new green shoots appeared on the bare branches of shrubs and trees. And the villagers began plowing the muddy fields for the summer crops. Beadle sometimes feared Jane Sharp was a witch, for she mumbled to herself, and once a pail of milk curdled as she passed. But mostly she knew Jane was just what she first appeared, a woman neither young nor old, neither fat nor thin, with a sharp nose and a sharp glance, and a wimple starched into her sharp pleats. Each morning, Beadle started the fire, blowing on the night's embers to encourage them to light the new day's scraps. She swept the cottage's dirt floor, sprinkled it with water, and stamped it to keep it hard packed. She roasted the bacon and washed up the mugs and knives and sprinkled fleabane around to keep the fleas down. She dusted the shelves packed with jugs and flasks and leather bottles of dragon dung and mouse ears, frog liver and ashes of toad, snail jelly, borage leaves, nettle juice, and the powdered bark of the black alder tree. In the afternoon, Beadle left the village for the woods, where she gathered honey, trapped birds, and collected herbs, leeches, and spider webs, and the cat went with her. When they were called, she accompanied the midwife to any cottage where a woman labored to birth her baby, provided that the woman could pay a silver penny or a length of newly woven cloth, or the best layer in the hen house. Beadle carried the basket with the clean linen, ragwort, and columbine seeds to speed the birth, cobwebs for staunching blood, bryony and woolly nightshade to cleanse and comfort the mother, goat's beard to bring forth her milk, and sage tea for too much, jasper stone as a charm against misfortune, and mistletoe and elder leaves against witches. Beadle waited outside while the midwife did her magic within. The first time they were called to a cottage, Beadle tried to go in, but Jane slapped her, calling her a clodpole and a shallow-brained whiffler, and made her stay outside where she wouldn't get in the way. Often she called Beadle in when it was over to clean out the soiled straw bed and wash the linen, while Jane Sharp and the new mother sipped feverfew and nutmeg brewed in hot ale. And once she sent the girl back to the cottage to brew some black currant syrup to fight a new mother's fever. Beadle began to think perhaps that she was kept out, not because she was stupid, but to keep her in ignorance of the midwife's skills and spells. And she was right. As the weather warmed and the villagers began digging long furrows in the field to take the seed, Beetle found herself doing more and more of the collecting and stewing and brewing, while Jane Sharp spent her time haggling over her fees. Twice the midwife refused to come into laboring mothers who had nothing to pay, and so the unfortunate women had to bring forth their babies with none but a neighbor to help. The midwife's greed angered the villagers, but they needed her, so they took out their anger not on Jane Sharp, but on her apprentice, needed by no one. Beetle endured their anger and their taunts in silence and complained only to the cat, who listened and sometimes rubbed his head on her legs in sympathy. When spring arrived with soft breezes and meadows grown green, the villagers began sowing early peas and barley, followed by the village boys who threw stones at the hungry birds, trying to eat the seed. Jack and Watt threw stones too at Beetle and the cat who followed her, which made the villagers laugh. Beetle was only the midwife's stupid apprentice, and no one cared to them. One morning, not too long before May Day, Kate, the weaver's daughter, lay down in the fields and declared her baby was coming right there. And right then, her father, Robert Weaver, and her husband, Thomas the Stutterer, tried to carry her back to their cottage, but she screamed and threw her arms about. So there was nothing to do but mount up some clean straw for a bed and bring the midwife out to the field. Jane Sharp looked at the girl, settled the fee with Thomas, and rolled up her sleeves. She sent Beetle back to the cottage to pack a basket of necessaries. And don't drop or forget anything, you with the brains of a chicken, and don't dawdle. Beetle grabbed bottles off the shelf and bunches of dried herbs from the ceiling beams. Surprised at how much she knew, she could recognize the syrups and powders and ointments and herbs from their look and their smell. Since the midwife could not write to make labels, Beetle would not have been able to read them even if she could. Kate was laboring in the field, not at plowing or sowing or weeding, but at making a way for her baby into the world. As Beetle watched, Jane moved Kate up onto her knees and shouted, "Push, you cow. If an animal can do it, you can do it." And Kate pushed, and as Jane, the midwife, eased the child out of his mother and into her hands, it put Beetle in mind of the time she got the cat out of the bag, and she temporarily forgave the midwife for her sharpness, for the magic of her spells, and the miracle of her skills. After that, Beetle took to watching through the windows when the midwife was called. In that way, she learned that midwifery was as much about hard work and good sense and comfrey tonic as spells and magic. Chapter 4, The Miller's Wife. Suddenly it was summer, and leaves erupted on every tree and bush in the village. You could see flowers blooming by the road, in the churchyard, and in the hair of the young girls as they swung down the path to the village square. And just as the world burst into flowers, the midwife's cottage burst forth into bread. Soft wheat bread for dinner, and crunchy brown oat bread for supper, and crusty rolls to dip in cool ale on a warm summer morning. Even Beetle shared in the sudden bloom of bread and didn't care to ask why until her stomach was finally full. She found her mind empty and her stomach finally full, and casting about for something to figure out, she hit upon the mystery of the all of a sudden abundance of bread. From where and how and why? And as she thought and watched and listened, Beetle noted that the midwife had taken to mysterious errands. Beetle, I must to the miller to have my oats ground to flour. Crush the bitter milkwort and boil the wormwood syrup while I am gone. And off the midwife would go without the oats. Or Beetle, I'm taking the comfrey tonic to Joan at the bridge. See you finish boiling the goose grease for ointments. And off the midwife would go without no comfrey tonic. Or, Beetle, I'm going to feed the hens. Strain the nettle tea and pour it into clean flasks. And off the midwife would go, though Beetle knew the last hen had made soup weeks before, and the hen house lay empty, except for an occasional hopeful, hungry dog. Curious about this unusual behavior, Beetle began to follow the midwife when she went on these errands, creeping behind trees and under fences, careful to keep out of sight, and the cat stalked along behind her. So they looked like a Corpus Christi Day procession on its way to the churchyard, the midwife, the girl, and the cat. Each time the midwife made for a field near the old North Road, and each time Beetle feared to creep closer lest she be caught. So she could not discover what was happening in the field and whether it had anything to do with the bread. One bright morning, 3 days before St. John's Eve, Beetle said, Mistress, Meg from the Manor Dairy has asked for some of your goose grease ointment, for her legs ache from child carrying, and she says nothing soothes like your goose grease ointment. She will pay you 4 eggs and a tot of butter. The midwife, pleased both to be praised and to be paid, sent Beetle on her way, without telling her to return straight away or setting chores for her to do after. Beetle raced to the dairy, thrust the greasy ointment at Meg, grabbed the eggs and the butter, tied them in her skirt, and ran by her secret hidden way to the field by the old North Road. She put the butter and eggs carefully in a hollow log and climbed a tree from which she could see the whole of the field. In no time there came Jane Sharp from the village, and from the other path with a basket of bread steaming and warm came the baker. Jane Sharp and the baker fell to such furious hugging and kissing, and him with a wife and 13 children in their cottage behind the ovens, that the startled Beetle fell right out of the tree. The baker caught her by her hair, and the midwife began shouting about how apprentices had nothing to do but spy, needed a beating and more work. Then Jane hissed, and don't you be telling anyone, Beetle, or I'll turn you out into the cold again and break both of your knees before I do. And who would I be telling then? Beetle responded. I don't talk to no one but the cat, and he don't care who you're kissing. And with that, which had taken all her courage, Beetle gathered up the butter and the eggs, only one of which had broken, and marched away. The cat marched behind her, hearing Beetle mumbling, You don't want to hear for this, for it is not mysterious at all, and was not an adventure, and there are no butterflies in it, or rats or mice, or cream or moths, which is all you really care about. Beetle muttered to the cat all the way back to the college, where she sat in the yard throwing green apples at the cow and waited for the midwife to return to give her a beating and more work. When the sun was high in the sky, there came the miller running into the yard. We need the midwife. She is not here. Where is she? I cannot say. And Beetle could not, for she had promised she would not. The miller grabbed Beetle's arm. Then you, Dung Beetle, will have to do it, and off he dragged her by the arm to his cottage. I cannot, she said. I am afraid. I do not know what to do. I cannot. But he continued grabbing and dragging, and soon Beetle was inside the miller's cottage. At any other time, she would have enjoyed the visit, for she had never been in such luxurious dwelling, with 2 rooms downstairs and a loft above, and a high, soft bed, all enclosed by curtains, such as the king or the pope must sleep in. But this was now and not any other time, and on the high, soft bed lay a large, pale woman waiting for the midwife and getting Beetle instead. The miller thrust Beetle toward the bed. The midwife's apprentice is here to help you, my dear. Things will go easier now, and he was gone. The miller's wife lay uneasy in her great bed. She grabbed Beetle's arm and cried, I no longer want this child. It was a mistake. Make it stop. I will do this no longer. I cannot, said Beetle. I am sore afraid. And that the miller's wife's cry increased in frequency and volume. Beetle tried to think what the midwife had said at moments like this. 2 eggs and a laying hen, and push, you cow, were the words that occurred to her. But when Beetle spoke them, they did not have the same effect as when the midwife did. By the bones of Saint Cuthbert, they have sent me a nitwit. You lack wit, no brain. You think to touch me? Screeching still, the miller's wife let go of Beetle's arm and began to throw at the girl whatever she could reach from her bed. A jug of warm ale, a half loaf of bread, a sausage, the brimming chamber pot. The terrified Beetle huddled in the corner as the woman rose from her bed to find more weaponry, a side of bacon, a bowl of stew, a walking stick, a soft felt hat, and someone's breeches. Half the village, it seemed, then pushed into the chamber to see the cause of the turmoil. The summer sun, the press of the curious crowd, and the exertions of the reluctant mother-to-be warmed the room to the point that Beetle felt that she was in hell, being attacked by demons, and her screams joined the rest. Suddenly the door flew open, and there stood the midwife, steaming rising for her skin in the heat of the room. A pea and onion pudding landed at her feet, and she was not smiling. Out, she shouted. Out, she screamed. Out, she bellowed, and the room fell empty. The midwife grabbed the miller's screeching wife and slapped her, once, twice, 3 and 4 times. Beetle lost count. Finally, both the screaming and the slapping stopped. The midwife left the miller's wife back into the high, soft bed and, holding her bruised face in her hands, poured a mug of wormwood tea down her throat. When all was quiet, the miller's wife began her labors again, and finally, Beetle told the cat, There come a baby. It was then that the midwife spied Beetle in the corner. Idiot, she shouted. Clodpole, she screamed. Nincompoop, she bellowed. And she dragged Beetle out of the room, across the yard, and back to her cottage by the very arm the miller had used to drag her away. Beetle did not mind so very much. She was just grateful to be out of that room. For weeks after that, the midwife called her not Beetle, but brainless brat and clodpole and good for nothing. And Beetle worked twice as hard and talked only half as much, for she feared being turned cold and hungry out of the midwife's cottage.